In 1918, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson saw a path to peace for a world at war. He had been re-elected in 1916 by promising the U.S. would stay out of the European conflict, but circumstances took us to war anyway. The Germans were losing. The German people knew it and were starting to rebel against Kaiser Wilhelm II. And Wilson saw an opportunity to end the war early and hopefully prevent another one by allowing the native peoples of Europe to control their native lands. The Russians would get Russia, the French would get France, the Italians would get Italy, the Germans would get Germany, the Polish would get Poland, the Turkish would get Turkey. Down the list he went. Essentially, he wanted to give the people of Europe autonomous control of themselves. Sadly, though, Wilson stopped with Europe and did not seem at all bothered by the brutal colonialism that was oppressing native people of color around the world. And while Wilson was not particularly keen on forcing Germany to pay war reparations, he conceded to them at Versailles, where the final treaty was negotiated. Wilson wanted to let the powers of Europe off scot-free for this horrible and pointless war, recognizing that there was plenty of blame to go around. But France was insistent. Germany would pay for the war. The Treaty of Versailles ended up being a compromise in all the wrong directions. The economist John Maynard Keynes was the principal representative of the British Treasury at the Paris Peace Conference, and he tried in vain to achieve the fairer principles for a lasting peace set out in President Wilson's 14 points. He said, "I believe that the campaign for securing out of Germany the general costs of the war was one of the most serious acts of political unwisdom for which our statesmen have ever been responsible." Keynes wrote The Economic Consequences of the Peace, arguing that the reparations would be so disastrous for Germany that they were bound to seek revenge rather than pay them. The book ended up being a surprise bestseller. Keynes was right to be worried, though the war reparations were not as burdensome to Germany as he believed. They could have been paid, but he was right that the German people were not eager to make sacrifices to pay for a war their leaders had pulled them into. The German emperor was replaced by the Weimar Republic, which elected its leaders. Rather than making the tough choices, the elected leaders passed many populist programs to aid the German people as they recovered from the war, while also keeping taxes low. With all this additional spending, in combination with the reparations, the only way to pay for it without raising taxes was to print more money, which is exactly what they did. Inflation came quickly, but it was manageable for a few years. By 1922, however, inflation reached staggering levels. In 1922, a loaf of bread cost 163 marks. By September of 1923, you needed 1.5 million marks to buy a loaf of bread. And just 2 months later, a loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. People had to be paid every hour, and they would run home to get the money to their families so they could go out and spend it right away before it became worthless. The picture here shows a man using marks as wallpaper, as they had already become totally worthless. Eventually, the currency had to be completely replaced, which finally happened in 1924, but not without a great deal of economic and political instability. A group of 2,000 political extremists attempted a violent coup d'etat inspired by the successful one led by Benito Mussolini in Italy the year prior. But in Germany, they were put back by the police in what would be called the beer hall putsch. The leader of the attempt was jailed for treason, but judges sympathetic to his cause gave him a light sentence. He wrote a book from prison, and the whole affair made his name, Adolf Hitler, known to the world. After World War I, the United States had shifted almost overnight from the world's biggest debtor to the world's biggest creditor. New York was providing more loans to the world than London, and the war-impoverished world needed this credit to get back on its feet, often striving to produce goods and services that they could then sell to America in order to pay off their debts to America. Economic growth in Latin American countries like Chile, Bolivia, and Peru was dependent on these loans, as were the economies of Britain, France, and Germany. Beyond this special place in the global economy that America held, these countries were also bound together by the gold standard, which meant that the relative value of their currencies could not fluctuate, meaning that their gold reserves would. When the great crash of 1929 hit America, it rapidly spread to these other countries, and panic about American gold led many to withdraw the gold they had in these foreign banks, pushing up interest rates in those countries and instigating recessions in all of them. What's more, American banks, desperate to liquidate their assets for cash to meet depositor demands, called in their loans to many of the banks, businesses, and enterprises in these foreign countries. Particularly hard hit was Germany, who relied on American loans to keep paying its war reparations without risking hyperinflation again. By mid-1931, Germany's financial system was in freefall. President Hoover called for a moratorium on reparation payments, but France objected, as they were reliant on them to get by themselves. Unemployment in Germany reached 25% in 1932, but with a deep fear of inflation, the government did not do anything to ease the pain. Unemployment rose further to 30%, and that summer, the German people were divided. They elected communists and Nazis, but the re-elected president, Paul von Hindenburg, agreed to a deal that made Adolf Hitler the Chancellor of Germany, mere months before Franklin Roosevelt would be sworn in as the American president. Industrialization brought incredible wealth to the average person, lifting them out of poverty and into a bourgeois life. But it also made monsters out of the monarchs and despots who still had control over their countries, and they turned the power of industry on each other and on the world. World War I proved so violent and devastating that the nations of the world resolved never to do it again, but they couldn't agree on how. All the while, the people of these countries, ignored by the powers that be, were paying the price of the conflict. Then a global economic depression came, and in their despair, they turned away from the liberty that brought about our economic miracle and towards the opposing forces of socialism and fascism. But rather than allow the socialists to destroy their economy, the fascists were content to elect, quite frankly, the worst people in the world, who instead took away their liberty and marched the world again to the brink. We today, and indeed the world, are tremendously lucky that America managed to find a different path in which our extremists were sidelined by competent leadership and a continued belief in liberty. I always hesitate to editorialize like this. Okay, no I don't. But I do so to make one very critical point. It is economic conditions that drive these world events. The business cycle wasn't just threatening our economic prosperity, it was becoming an existential threat to humanity itself. And despite the best efforts of the classical economists, it was a problem that had definitely not been solved for good. There was a need for fresh ideas. Luckily, the world had John Maynard Keynes.